Okay, hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Frank. I graduated from College of Arts and Sciences in 2003. I'm here today in my capacity as a member of the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Advisory Board, and I want to welcome you to today's Arts and Sciences Alumni Academy. The College of Arts and Sciences offers these Zoom talks as a way of letting alumni know of the great research and scholarship happening in the college. Today, we are pleased to present the science of shipwrecks. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items to share. First, we ask everyone to mute their microphones. This will ensure that everyone can hear our presenter. We are recording this event and it will be shared on the college's website for people to view after this evening. If you do not want your image recorded, please feel free to turn off your camera. Closed captioning services are provided for this event. At this time, please direct your attention to the chat for additional instructions on the closed caption and a few other informational items. Right now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Cathryn Newton is a professor of marine paleoecology in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Her scholarly work involves studies of modern and ancient biodiversity, including the quantitative dynamics of ancient and modern mass extinction. Dr. Newman is also Dean Emerita of the College of Arts and Sciences and a longtime senior advisor to the Chancellor and Provost for the faculty engagement. She has degrees from Duke University, the University of North Carolina, and the University of California at Santa Cruz. She joined the faculty of Syracuse University in 1983, and in 1993, she became the chair of the Department of Earth Sciences. From 2001 to 2008, Dr. Newton served as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. She was the first woman on the college's history to serve as Dean. We are very fortunate to have her join us for today's presentation. Welcome, Dr. Newman, and thank you for joining us. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's a little overwhelming, that beautiful introduction, Karen. I really appreciate this. And what a joy it is to look at the people here in the room and to recognize so many wonderful former students and colleagues and friends of all kinds. Thank you so much for being here. I've been invited today to talk about something that is both a very long-term research project for me, the science of shipwrecks, and I'll tell you the story of how that began and the first shipwreck that I was involved in a collaborative discovery. And then I will talk a little bit about the course that we now offer in the honors program, a course that some of you are deeply familiar with. We even have some veterans of that course on this call, so I love that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the future of shipwrecks and the ways in which the changing science of the oceans can be gleaned a bit. Both the changing science of the ocean both informs on the future of shipwrecks, and it also learns from the science of shipwrecks. That is, shipwrecks can tell us things about the ocean. So we're going to take a little bit of a walk through discovering shipwrecks and the experiences of discovering shipwrecks, both the scientific and also some of the cultural parts of that. Because in my class, which is ongoing now this fall semester, the class is a strongly ocean and lake sciences class, but it leads toward the science of shipwrecks. And we're in mid-semester and there are 16 very busy students now. We're just about to go out into the field, as a number of you have done with me over time. So I want to just begin with a story about how I got involved in this, but it's a science story and it informs on the history of science as well. If I might have the next slide, please. So the first thing my students have to struggle with is, what is a shipwreck? And we know when we're going to begin with the fact that a shipwreck is an anomaly on the ocean floor, a cultural product, It is in every sense a fossil. Those of us, like several of us on the call who are trained in paleontology, a shipwreck is conventionally a fossil, evidence of past life. And shipwreck also allows us to study the ocean processes that are happening both on it, in it, and around it. Often a shipwreck becomes a biological reef, but a shipwreck is also a lot more than that. A shipwreck, we need to realize, is often a human tragedy. It is often a business loss for which insurers have to pay out. Often it's a state-to-state actor incident, a nation-to-nation incident, and there are many of shipwrecks that have been involved in beginning wars of various kinds. It's therefore also a military incident in many cases. I mentioned a business loss. People who are interested in structures, I know we have some people who have done work on design and architecture. It's also a structural failure, but what else might it also be? Well, one other thing that it is often a grave, and we will come to that because here the tools of cultural analysis, scientific analysis, and also the kind of paleontology that a number of us were trained in comes right into play. And so what we try to do in this course is to synthesize the ocean and geological processes, but rather than to set aside the cultural parts, to engage in the cultural parts. If I might have the next slide then, please. To do that, we have to be able to describe what a ship does. And I find that very few people on the planet have, of course, naval architects do this every day, but very few people have been challenged, as my students are in the Honors 350, the Science of Shipwrecks, to try to make an objective and generally applicable description of what a ship does. And one very common place this leads as we talk with students is a lot of students want to make the definition about what we're seeing here, which is the ocean-air interface or the ocean-atmosphere interface. And of course, we see a beautiful sailing ship here, and we can infer a lot about what's going on and in the water and in the atmosphere from both the behavior of the ship, the behavior of the surface of the water, and the orientation of the sails. But we quickly run into problems, don't we, as we think about the broader range of ships. And next, please. As we think about the broader range of ships, we quickly come into trouble because we realize, if we think more deeply, that ships are often exploiting the buoyancy properties of water. And this would be true of the organisms we see swimming here in this slide, including the human organism in this slide, the human in this slide, the diver from the state of North Carolina. But it would also be true of the multiple fish in the slide and true of all of the swimming marine invertebrates and of any plankton that are present in the water column. That is, buoyancy is a property that we build into ships, but our understanding of buoyancy is informed by organisms in nature as well. So this is really a challenge as we're beginning to think about and talk about shipwrecks, a challenge for the students and frankly also a challenge for those of us who work in the field. Because ships and the maritime culture are so much a part of various coastal and mainland cultures around the world, that we can even say that we have both actual shipwrecks and we have quite a few metaphorical ships and shipwrecks. And so the eligible set of shipwrecks becomes quite large. And I'll just use a couple of examples now that I find quite moving. When they excavated the World Trade Center site, beneath one of the locations was a shipwreck. And it wasn't even fully known that there would be shipwrecks there. But of course, much of Lower Manhattan a lot of Boston near the Charles, and including a wide swath of MIT. There are lots and lots of places, both in our country and in others, that are built on fill. These are marine sediments or other sediments that are brought in. And so we frequently find shipwrecks on land as well as shipwrecks on sea. Now, this shipwreck happened so quickly that people had only a couple of minutes to get out of the ship, and it was already under a lot of pressure. You can see some parts of this, the story of what happened here. This is U-701 from July 1942. People had almost no time to get out of the ship before it sank. The stern section is just blasted away, and people there died instantly. But you see the conning tower hatch still open, and indeed the commander of the shipwreck wrote in some letters that I now have and have been involved in using to write on U-701 and to research on this, that would you please get my binoculars, which are just on the ladder to the conning tower hatch, that ladder to safety that about, I think it was something like 40 some of his crew used to get to safety. 3 days later, the men in the water, there were only 7 of them left. And those 7, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. My first and most important point is you cannot work on the science of shipwrecks without understanding the culture and history of how the shipwrecks came to be there, because otherwise you're going to be missing a lot. Next slide, please. So the story of shipwrecks is the story of tragedy. Some of the shipwrecks are graves. It's the story of business and who's doing commerce with whom, which states, which nations are plying the seas for trade. And it's the story, of course, of military encounters and much, much more. For our purposes, the rapid evolution of ocean sciences made it possible for us to have more and more tools to discover and then research shipwrecks. This that we're looking at here is the most famous missing ship in America. I'll come back to this in just a moment. This is the bow of the USS Monitor, an image from recent years. This is a NOAA diver taking this picture, and we will come back to the significance of this. Next slide, please. So as a 16-year-old sophomore at Duke, we talk a lot about undergraduate research, and I was a very lucky Duke undergraduate to have an opportunity to do several projects. And one of the projects that I thought was just a transitory thing turned out to be a subject that I have stayed with now for more than 50 years. And that is the opportunity to work in the summer of 1973 when I was a 16-year-old rising Duke sophomore with 4 of the most accomplished principal investigators who had decided to go out and do 2 things using both National Science Foundation and National Geographic funding. And one of them was to map the remaining unmapped parts of the Hatteras Submarine Canyon, a very dynamic submarine canyon off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, about 16 miles southeast of Hatteras, but also to search for the USS Monitor, the Civil War ironclad that had been missing for 111 years, and which the Navy had searched for from the moment of its loss until the 1950s, when it surrendered responsibility for the site. Let's put it that way. On the Monitor, there were 62 men and there were 16 people who were lost. The Monitor was born to try to save the United States, the Union, at a time in which the Confederate war on land was decisive and was prevailing. We'll talk about how the ship was built very briefly. so that we can know what we were looking for. What I love about this picture is that it shows all of the principal investigators, including on the right, probably one of my two most important mentors in the future. This is Harold Doc Edgerton, the strobe pioneer of MIT. He had invented most of the instruments that were used over-the-rail instruments on oceanographic ships at this time, and was continuing to invent and refine both the side scan sonar and the still underwater camera at this time. Moving counterclockwise, here's your 16-year-old sophomore. Then John Newton, my father, was an administrator at the Duke Marine Lab, and he had done the most prominent compilation of ocean processes off North Carolina, including, and this was just a sidelight, a compilation of he had taken this from about 500 shipwrecks to about 1,100 shipwrecks in what is known as one of the graveyards of the Atlantic, John Newton. Then to his right is one of the most famous geophysicists of the late 20th and early 21st century, Bob Sheridan of Rutgers, who found the oldest crust in the Atlantic Ocean and is responsible for changing a lot of ways we think about the deep ocean crust. And then finally, looking like a very young Ashton Kutcher in the group, is a newly minted marine archaeologist who was the first marine archaeologist ever of the state of North Carolina. Next slide, please. When you're looking for a shipwreck as we were, you have to know what to look for. And we go to Brooklyn. This is January 1862 in Brooklyn, as the first ironclad slid down the rail. This is a true ironclad designed and constructed. It's a little ship compared to the wooden steam frigates. I love this picture because it shows the dinosaurs off in the distance, the about to become extinct wooden steam frigates. Shipyards of that day, as Frederick Douglass's autobiography from a few years earlier make clear, were highly multicultural, representing lots of nations, all races, and these people are cheering the descent of this vessel meant to save the Union. Next slide, please. We are looking for a cheese box on a raft, therefore. It has planar decks with only 18 inches of freeboard. That's a mere 18 inches of gap between the water line and the deck, just perilously low. We're looking for something with a cylindrical turret, 172-foot length, a beam of 41.5 feet, and a depth of only about 11 feet. 2 Dahlgren guns. So we have our target of what we're looking for as we go out to find Monitor. Next slide, please. And we also have some beautiful photographs that are contemporary photographs, only a single series. So to find a shipwreck, you do as Bob Ballard, one of my father's mentees when he was a postdoc. Bob Ballard, who later found the Titanic, used the same principles and same scientific approaches we use to look for Monitor. You always go back to look at the modifications of the vessel. In this case, we're looking at the modified pilot house. The skipper would have been beneath this area. There would have been openings to see. Here we see the damage done by the USS Monitor during that famous Battle of the Ironclads, in which the Monitor did fulfill its mission. And so it's considered a success for the Monitor, even though both sides celebrated that night, celebrated victory. Next slide. If we could, yeah. The thing that wrapped itself around my heart early on was seeing these pictures of the crew of Monitor. These are people at ease. And we see one standing at the top of the turret. We see people playing board games. We see someone reading a letter. We see people with homemade shoes. We see people with no shoes. This is what the armies and navies looked like. Again, this is a highly diverse group. We have other pictures that have pictures of African Americans that have swum to safety. They swam to safety from the adjoining Maryland and Virginia borders of Chesapeake Bay where these pictures were taken. So it's just a remarkable cultural story. And by number, most of the people on this ship were like this. They were everyday crew members. One of them was from Syracuse, New York. People who swam to safety, people who were not American citizens, but for whom being in the Union Navy was a path to citizenship. Just a remarkable array and a remarkable story. And here you see just, we're looking more at what we're looking for when we search for the shipwreck as well, the turret, the dents, the deck, all of it. Now, let's talk about a couple of things more before we go to the discovery. Next, please. Oh, these somewhat more dour looking people are the officers. Again, a diverse group as well, but 4 of these people are not going to make it to the end of the year. That is, among the 16 of the people who go down when the ship goes down are 4 of these officers. And so it was kind of a tragedy all around to lose 16 people. Next slide. The story of the inventor is also a story of immigrants and a story of the changing culture from a farm economy in both North and South to an industrial economy in both North and South. John Ericsson was a Swede. There he invented a number of things for the growing coal industry and canal system in Sweden. But then he immigrated to the US and he's credited with the screw propeller, a series of solar devices, of course, the USS Monitor, a series of ship's guns, devices that could use sunshine to assist the California agricultural practices. He's revered on both sides of the Atlantic. And so John Ericsson is credited with this design, and you will find tributes, public memory of him in Battery Park in Lower Manhattan, in Washington, right near the Lincoln Memorial, right near the president whose cause he helped to support and save. In Brooklyn, where there's also a school named after him, and of course, many, many sites in Sweden. Next slide. Well, I think you can look at this picture and tell a lot about the person. He is small and mighty. He is determined. He is smart. He is not going to let go of a project. And in this case, we saw the ship sliding down the rails after only a little over 100 days. But Ericsson was also one of the business partners in this, and he was also the construction manager as well as liaison to the federal government. He was an in-charge kind of guy, and we're just very fortunate that it was to the United States that he managed to sell this ironclad design, which he had offered to Napoleon III and other governments as well. Next slide, please. All right, so we're looking for a cylindrical turret. We're looking for a turret that has only 2 circular ports. What could possibly go wrong? These were the only openings through which the everyday sailors could see when they fired shots at CSS Virginia, the iron armored combatant that Monitor was designed to fight. Twin iron hull, a pilot house forward and separate from the turret. Here's something interesting. That cylindrical turret rests by gravity on the deck. Ericsson did not want the seamen to fill the gaps with oakum, which is a substance that you typically use to fill floorboards on a ship of that era. And then the deck has only 18 inches of freeboard. Next. Next. So what are the greatest design strengths? This thing had a very low profile and was very hard for the either the CSS Virginia or the wooden steam frigates to be able to accurately enough aim their ammunition. Of course, CSS Virginia and Monitor were almost alongside one another. They were very, very close, but it was quite low slung in the water. It also had mobility of the guns, which a lot of other vessels do not. These strengths are also the greatest vulnerabilities. Let's see next, please. So on December 30th, 1862, the Monitor was being towed by the USS Rhode Island, a sidewheel steamer, down to Charleston because the war in Charleston was not going well. One of those warm winter December storms brewed up off Cape Hatteras, and the 15-foot waves. So Monitor had almost swamped on its maiden voyage, on its inaugural voyage. But in this case, the far higher waves did, in fact, go across the deck, as you see here, and into that gap between the turret and the hull. We're looking at 1, 2, 3 lifeboats that are coming off the Monitor. Look closely. You'll also see somewhere there are 4 men being swept off the deck of Monitor. There were at least 4 swept off. There were some in the hull, and there are 2 men at the very top of the turret. Now, why would mariners not descend the ladder? Do you know this, that even now many mariners do not know how to swim? Can we think about why that might be? Well, 16 miles off Hatteras, mariners who had mainly worked in blue water quite frequently will not know how to swim. And 16 miles off Hatteras, we would have a situation where the ability to swim might actually be an illusion. So the last sighting of the vessel was one in which there were still mariners on top of the turret. These 2 lifeboats made it back to the Rhode Island, and men taken aboard soaking and terrified. Even more terrifying is that this lifeboat could not be seen on the other side of the ship, and the Rhode Island thought that they had not returned, that they had been swamped. And so Rhode Island steams off and goes back to Beaufort, North Carolina, abandoning these men in the water. Only later does a passing ship pick up the luckiest mariners in America. And they are rescued and also brought to Beaufort. That very night, the lantern that's at the bow of Monitor is seen for the last time, and the ship sinks to the bottom, sinks all the way to the bottom to the sandy, gravelly site beneath the Gulf Stream. This is one of the most dynamic parts of the world ocean, and is lost for 111 years with 16 souls. So our job was to try to find this after all of that time. Next slide. We took a different approach. The 4 PIs decided to use the log from the USS Rhode Island and take the mariners at their word. The mariners knew when they would go from the water of the Labrador Current to the water of the Gulf Stream, both in clarity and temperature and color and sediment load. And so we have records of what time the 2 ships passed these boundaries and where the ship was relative to the coastline. And so the interesting experience was to be on board this cruise and to be mentored by these 4 outstanding scientists. And little wonder that coming here, I wanted to teach on the subjects and to teach basically ocean sciences, but with shipwrecks as the vehicle and medium. Doc Edgerton was especially an important mentor for me. Next slide. Because it was he who pioneered the strobe in some very important ways that touch both art and science in photography. His famous milk drop experiment has been hanging in the Museum of Modern Art since 1957. Doc was considered one of the foremost photographers of the second and third quarters of the 20th century. And I just learned so much from him about defying that false taxonomy between art and humanities and science. Next, please. So we set out to find Monitor on a ship approximately the same size, just a little shorter in length, about the same in beam, and similar in depth. Perhaps eastward is a little bit shorter, if anything. The other part I wanted to mention is that sometimes during my presentation, you may hear the ship's bell. That's quite intentional. This is the ship's bell of the RV Eastward that Duke gave to me when the ship was decommissioned. Next slide. We use the kind of swath mapping method that you might use when you're mowing the lawn, back and forth, accounting for the 4 knots, the ultra-fast speed of the Gulf Stream. So we created a search grid that went downstream tens of miles from the Gulf Stream. And we used magnetometer, of course, the depth recorder, and a seismic recorder as well. That is a shallow penetration seismic, the side scan sonar, underwater TV, and something like GPS today, only this was microwave based. And it required dangling someone over the side of the Cape Hatteras lighthouse to have one of the transponders. I believe risk management would not allow that today, folks. Next. And quite valuable. I was the only, at 16, I was the only one who kept a journal of the expedition, and have been asked to write on this and have a draft. And I just would mention to you how valuable it is to have an expedition diary. For 2 days, we were on a ship that, as you see here, looks a lot like Monitor, with a circular structure, a double hull, the right length, and so forth. But it was an oddity in that the cylindrical structure seemed to be off to one side. Really odd. It wasn't amidships as we had thought it would be in the center of the ship as well. Next. So it took us a number of months, but the person who first finally realized what we were seeing was actually an artist who was working to help create this collage with my father and the archaeologist Gordon Watts. This is somewhat blurry by our standards today, but the first mosaic ever done of Monitor after, in this case, 112 years by the time it was finished. And here we are, we're looking at the turret, and we're looking at the lower part of the hull. So you guessed it. The Monitor had turned turtle as it flipped by the waves. The hull was slower to sink in the water column. The turret fell off. The turret is on the left lower side of your field of view here. And so we finally figured out what it was. And on March 9th, 1974, the date of the Battle of the Ironclads at Duke University, we announced this, and it was published the following day in the New York Times front page, and was on the Walter Cronkite program. Well, you can imagine what this was like for a 16-year-old girl. And so shipwrecks have never left me, and an interest in the ocean and in marine ecology and paleoecology have never left me. So let's go through some other examples, and then we need to talk about what the implications of working with the science of shipwrecks are. Next. Next, please. Here's something you probably didn't know, that in 1972, Congress had passed the Marine Sanctuaries Act, and we were very fortunate and, of course, eager to conserve this priceless wreck that we had found on the last days of our 2-week expedition off Cape Hatteras in some fairly bumpy seas ourselves. And so what a remarkable experience for a young one to be involved with a group of the discoverers who were at the time our discoverers, the four that you have seen, including some of the rest of us, saw and responded and witnessed the evolution of drafts of the proposal for the first ever U.S. Marine Sanctuary. We are just about to celebrate that in January of 1975. For those of you who might remember this era, Frederick B. Dent was then the Secretary of Commerce. He signed the documents, but then other secretaries of commerce included the Rogers Morton, who was a famous name from Secretary of the Interior, Juanita Krebs, and many, many others. Now, in the years since, it took a long time between the Monitor Marine Sanctuary and the next one. Just like in Women in Science, it takes a very long time between the first woman in science in the department, and in my case, 16 years between then and the second woman in science in the department. And the same way with marine sanctuaries. It took a long, long time before there was a second and a third and a fourth. But how thrilling it is for me to look at the map, which you see in the lower left, of the modern marine sanctuaries. And some of these are absolutely vast, and many of them recognize shipwrecks because cultural heritage as well as marine ecology are two of the major criteria. Nearest to us is the just announced, can you barely see this? The Lake Ontario Marine Sanctuary, the youngest of the brood. So yay for Syracuse University. That was really an important partnership that we and other entities in the region, it was led by people in Oswego, and I'm sure our students will benefit from the newest hatched as well as the oldest hatched of the marine sanctuaries having a Syracuse connection. Next. Just want to point out something very briefly, which is that the ocean is not an orderly place relative to shipwrecks, and that right by Monitor were a series of World War II shipwrecks that included the U-701 that I showed you, and that in that same site were others of its victims. Oh, good questions coming in. Thank you. Others of its victims. And what you can think of as a metaphor here is that the same ocean processes, storms and fast currents and other things like this, can lead there to be sites such as the Monitor site, where you might have a Spanish galleon nearby, and you might also have a German U-boat and a bunch of its victims, as well as USS Monitor, as well as even older shipwrecks, because we know that maritime peoples along this coast made significant voyages. It's just the case that we're going to be seeing more and more and more indigenous shipwrecks. There's just no doubt about it. This year of 2024 has just seen many discoveries. I just want to show you a couple of pictures of U-701 very quickly, and we'll move past these. Because, next slide, as we had found the Monitor, we were approached by both the skipper of U-701 and the American aviator who shot him down. I've done some original work on the statistical analysis of shipwrecks along this shipwreck-tossed coast, and you can see that 1942 was a pretty dramatic increase of shipwrecks because that was when the German U-boats came to our shore. Next. And the cultural effects of this, because saboteurs were let off in multiple places, including one close to us, relatively close to us in Long Island. And Carl Dunitz, who was the mastermind behind this, had to first convince Hitler that it was something worth doing to bring the U-boats to our shores, where Hitler was relatively skeptical. Let's look at the next slide, please. Even Time magazine has pictures of Dönitz and the fear that the U-boats had caused. So I just want to show you a series, if we can just click through a series of panels here and look at some pictures of this sinking. Here's the captain next. Here is the captain after 3 days in the water. He was taken in and then given immediately for questioning. The thought being that's the best interrogation time. The American aviator who shot him down also wrote to us, and the two of them actually met in Norfolk, Virginia during the interrogation process. And I am still in touch with Horst Dagen's son of U701. We looked for one U701, a number of us on the cruise, and didn't find it. I just want to show you some further pictures because it's such a dramatic story. Next. Here's Harry Kane and the crew. An unusual feature was that after the U-boat went down and people came popping up to the surface, Harry Kane had a raft aboard and some provisions that his plane had in stock. By the way, you can see that some of these aviators are in midlife. One of the crew members was 45, right? It was a very different time. And so they circled around and dropped a life raft to the people of U701. Next slide, please. Well, here's why when you search for a U-boat, you might not find it. My father led a search in 1979 and 80 in the very site that had been mentioned by both Horst Dagen and Harry Kane as the likely site of the sinking. But it happens, and geologists had actually found this to be in a giant field of sand waves that in their amplitude, in their height, have exactly the same height as a U-boat. Let's look at some other pictures here. And so sometimes the U-boat is fully immersed as it was when it was found about 15 years later than when our team looked for it. This is a later image. But sometimes it was completely covered with sand waves. And that's why you need to understand the science of shipwrecks. If we had it all to do over, I think a search would have been done with some different scientific techniques on the same site. Next slide, please. So here's the condition in which the discovery took place. The deck gun, there are always deck guns on a U-boat. The deck gun was emergent, but very little else was, but it was enough to give a signal upon the profiler going past. Okay, just want to look at a couple of other things, please. Next. So the tip of the bow is either exposed or it's not exposed. You can see the story that scientific processes and shipwrecks go together. In terms of preservation, the best thing that can happen to a shipwreck is to be covered with sediment. I'd like to skip down through a couple of other slides, please, just very quickly. The giant sand waves will migrate past, covering the ship and then emerging it. Next. One of the victims of the U-boats is one on which I had a chance to sail and use some scientific methodologies as well. The Dixie Arrow was a tanker on its last run under the captain, and it was torpedoed in half, isolating the crew who were on the bow section from the emergency signal station on the stern section. And Dixie Arrow was later found, and I was invited by NOAA in 2011 to go study it. What a moving experience. Next slide. It was the first time the children of Captain Johansen had ever had a chance to pay respects to him. And so in addition to doing some sediment and other studies of the site, we carried some of the family members aboard. You see, when the military came to their home after Captain Johansen was lost, the two children were then 12 and 8. and they were told by the military personnel that on pain of death, that is, on pain of charges of treason, which would lead to death, they could never mention their father again. This was 75 years later that we visited the vessel, and you can see it's such a moving experience. Now we look for shipwrecks using very different technology. We have multi-beam seismic that we can use for ships that are now perhaps under sediment. Next slide, please. A big question that is taking all of our scientific, multi-field scientific study is that shipwrecks are disappearing, as the students might say, wicked fast. They're disappearing incredibly fast. It appears that there is an acceleration in the decay of shipwrecks such as the Titanic, and the far more rapid creation of, do you see these rusticles on the right side of the slide? How weird and eerie they are. They're not biologically eroded, but the bacteria, which are salt-living bacteria that live on and near shipwrecks, can bring iron into suspension, where then it goes into dissolution in the water and precipitates like stalactites and stalagmites. How weird this is. Next slide. And so the BBC even published a story saying a new bacterium, and this was a new bacterium, is devouring the Titanic. And some modelers suggested that the Titanic could be gone in as low as 15 years. Now we think it will be longer. So the shipwrecks themselves are also leading to some very important discoveries, because when you think about how deep and how cold the Titanic is, and that this bacterium has a higher population growth and activity rate, the warmer it gets, up to 40 degrees C, that these shipwrecks in shallow water are literally being dissolved away, many of them before our eyes. Next slide. So we see the destruction of a lot of iron ships is really accelerating from what we found in 1973, and again, the photographic technology that Doc himself had developed, versus what we now see of the site in 2010. And by the way, when they raised the turret in 2005, there were 2 men inside the turret right by the starboard hatch that we saw in the picture, the hatch that could have been their path to safety. I went to Arlington for their memorial and burial, and the memorial, if you're ever at Arlington Cemetery, the memorial for those men and others lost in Monitor is right by the memorials for the Columbia and Challenger space shuttles. Next slide. Shipwrecks also tell us about ocean processes, and there are lots of people studying shipwrecks as we believe the Gulf Stream and the overturning circulation leading from shallow to deep water that's a little further east of this diagram is also slowing down, a real peril. Next slide. I want to end by saying there are an estimated 3 million shipwrecks in the world ocean. It's not just Monitor and U-701 and remembering this one and that one that were in military encounters. It's how we learn about the culture of the single operator fishing ships 150 years ago. It's how we really learn who the people were on vessels of exploration. We don't only want to know the history of those people who were famous or the contents of famous ships. Earth's 3 million shipwrecks are, in some sense, partial time capsules by which we can fill in the missing pages of history and at the same time do excellent science and help with the evolution of science and technology. And yes, to my ocean and earth sciences and shipwrecks colleague, the the USS Monitor has now become a reef in its own regard, made of the kinds of corals that I have worked in several other areas. I'd like to stop the slideshow for now, please.
Well, thank you, Dr. Newton, so much for the presentation. It was fascinating, and I personally love how you brought to life, the history and context of these wonderful shipwrecks. At this time, I do want to open it up for questions, and I do see that we do have some in the chat already. So if you don't mind, I'll read some to you. Steve Kurtz asked, any thoughts on Clive Cussler's efforts to locate shipwrecks through historic research, including looking for wrecks on what is now land?
Yeah, Cussler is the real deal, because also a really good scientist is going to start with the written records, including written records in other languages, written records that have been hidden or are in people's attics. As we were working on this, letters from some of those regular mariners who were crewmen came available. And this opens up lots of good other questions about wrecks, what to look for. Was there a ship's cat, as all the kids want to know? What were people really doing and eating on the ship, and where might that shipwreck be? As the islands migrate, you are absolutely right. You see the old timers on all of our barrier islands. If you go back 200 years, old timers were building their houses as mobile homes. Did you know that? They knew that from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the sea level was already rising, and they built them horse cart high, so that a horse would just be pulled up to the house, and the house could be moved to the backside of the island as the island migrated toward the mainland. So Clive realized early on that a lot of marine shipwrecks are now in terrestrial localities. Good for him. And I really respect his work and his writing, and I'm glad you asked.
Thanks for that. If you do have questions, you can raise your hand by using the React button on the bottom of your navigation, and then select raise your hand, or you can put something in the chat as well. Our next question comes from Chuck Brownman, who asks, how has technology changed the searches for and discoveries of shipwrecks?
It's a great question, because the search for shipwrecks has also catalyzed the evolution of technology. It's a positive feedback loop. Think of this: in the Cold War, there was a need to be able to find shipwrecks of submarines, both our submarines and our opponent's submarines, as quickly as they happened. And so we actually had the design of both seismic and other technology, that is sound-based and other technology, in order to better map by swath mapping. So the difference is you can get your lawnmower over just one spot, but if you can put multiple probes down, I know this looks weird with my fingers near the screen here, but just trying to use a little model to show that you can cover much more area. And this was serious business, because the Scorpion was known to have been the victim of an attack in 1968. And so as the opposing navies became more and more sophisticated, then both the technology to find shipwrecks gets speeded up. The technology is higher precision, and even the recovery, the ability to grab a shipwreck or to move it in some other ways without collapse. And so even Howard Hughes, that famous reclusive person of yore, he was brought in to help recover a Russian submarine. So now what we're able to do in an hour is what would have taken us months to do at sea 50 years ago. And that's where the excitement is. And that's why our students in science and shipwrecks get involved.
Great. The next question comes from Kate Reeder. She asks, how far back do you have records for tides or currents, and are those records still used despite the new technologies?
Yeah, depends on where you're working. This is a great question. 16 miles off Hatteras, you barely need anything to do with tides. But if you're working near shore in the Barrier Island system, absolutely, you're going to need tide tables, and you're going to need. I was working a couple of years ago. Does anybody know the Mallows Bay National Marine Sanctuary? It's only 30 miles from the District of Columbia. I did a project there several years ago, and these, you might not think that a few inches would make a difference in a freshwater system like the Potomac, but it really, really does. And so some old-fashioned tide tables, and yes, with some difficulty, you can restore those back, right? So you're going to perhaps lose some precision because, of course, the shoreline is also changing in its morphology. That's a great question. And I do teach my students how to use and study timetables. We talk about the tides in class just a few weeks ago.
Wonderful. Speaking of students, Melissa Lewinson-Knoll asks, are you engaged in any research with current SU students?
Yes, I am, for two reasons. Actually, three reasons. One is I have had honors students do their senior theses with me on sites like the Mallows Bay site. And this is a kind of rainmaker thing, or a boost, because also students rarely get experience with some of the big federal agencies like this. And so getting to work with NOAA and getting to know both the marine biology part of NOAA and the like the ocean sciences part of NOAA and the marine sanctuary part of NOAA. It's really important for anybody's line of work to be able to navigate the larger systems. And so, yes, there always has been, I would say, especially in the last 15 years since, obviously when I was Dean of Arts and Sciences, it was a different story. But in these recent years, I really have loved having, especially honors students, work with me on some of these field sites. And there is one right now who's doing a project with me that involves both the National Seashore, which is under different management, and the NOAA Marine Sanctuary.
Very cool. Anybody have any other questions? You can again use the React button located at the bottom of the navigation to raise your hand. Oh, Chris Zeit, sorry if I mispronounced your name, asks, what can you tell us about the recently found shipwreck of a Spanish tall ship with a cargo of gold? Is it a conquistador ship leaving the Inca Empire?
What a great question. We are nowhere near having plumbed all of the Spanish transport ships. It's not just ships of exploration or military ships, but just think about all of the back and forthness of all of this. And of course, the mariners are the best oceanographers. Like hundreds of years before Benjamin Franklin not found, but Benjamin Franklin drew the first maps of the Gulf Stream, hundreds, maybe thousands of years, mariners knew that there was a North Atlantic gyre that was the quickest superhighway, right? You just get in the fast lane of the Gulf Stream and you're practically there to Europe. So we have many, many more Spanish galleons. I have a database of about 4,500 shipwrecks off North Carolina, and there are many, many Spanish ships, including ones that have gold. We also, members of our expedition, knew Mel Fisher when he was looking for the Atocha. And one thing he learned, and that other people have learned, is that your problems are just beginning when you find the galleon with gold and silver that you've been looking for 30 years. Now, why would that be? Well, because when you find the galleon, who comes to see you but with the people with beautiful leather briefcases from Madrid, and they say, you know, we never relinquished that ship. You know, we're going to see you in court about that ship. And even things like WikiLeaks, we find diplomatic cables about the conditions under which those Spanish ships, and for that matter, the German World War II ships have sunk. So I was delighted to see the next of the Spanish gold-bearing ships, but there are going to be more. That is absolutely got to be the case because, you know, we have found just a tiny fraction of the shipwrecks that are out there in the world ocean.
Interesting. Donnie Fletcher asks, has there been any SU research regarding slave shipwrecks during the Atlantic slave trade, or is that a special mission done by entities such as the Smithsonian?
Well, of course, the Smithsonian. Lonnie Bunch is very active with the Syracuse community. But beyond that, yes, there are now faculty, and there have been for years, who are shipwreck researchers who are in the Department of Anthropology. And I'm not talking about the physical anthropologists. I'm talking about people who are doing marine research on trying to locate possible sunken slave ships and other important cultural maritime sites that are related to that. So there's never just going to be something that's sunk out at sea. There are always going to be maritime cultures that support that. And so Syracuse has become, in my career here, a hub of shipwreck research. And that just reminds me that the most important message I have today is thank you to you all for being here with typical Syracuse moxie, you know, that we're going to get it done. That's typical about Syracuse. But also, we're going to get it done and take students with us. We always do that at Syracuse. So that's just who and how we are. And then I just need to say a thank you to Syracuse because most earth sciences departments just wouldn't have the stretch to be able to handle somebody who was both doing paleoecology and working on something as interdisciplinary as shipwrecks. So this is a double thank you for 40 years of love from Syracuse.
Well, thank you, Professor Newton, so much for joining us this evening. This was a fantastic discussion. I'm so happy we had a chance to learn from you today. And thank you all for joining us today. Stay tuned for more invitations for future presentations, and we hope to see you again. I'm going to ask Liz to close the Zoom meeting and have a great rest of your day.